Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to objectively map out the historical and theological arguments behind a fascinating, growing movement in Islamic thought, the Quran-centered framework. We'll be taking a close look at source material that challenges the traditional mainstream view and examining the logical progression that's leading some believers to totally reconsider the role of hadith. Okay, let's dive right into this with a central paradox presented by our sources. Imagine you buy something, and the instruction manual explicitly claims to be 100% complete. Would you need to go out and find a second manual to understand the first one? That's the core question here. How does a religion balance a holy text that claims to be fully detailed with a centuries-old tradition that insists that text simply can't be understood on its own? It's a really interesting logical tension.
And this maps out the exact journey we'll be taking today. The source traces a step-by-step progression, starting with the current mainstream position, moving through reflection points on the Quran's self-description, taking a critical look at history, and finally arriving at a reconsidered, entirely Quran-centered paradigm.
Part 1. The current position and the immediate theological tension it creates. The source highlights a pretty stark contradiction right out of the gate. On one side, you have the traditional belief, which holds that the Quran absolutely requires secondary sources, the hadith, which are the reported sayings and actions of Prophet Muhammad, to be properly understood and practiced. But on the other side, that idea contrasts directly with the Quran's own self-description, where it states it was sent down as a clarification for all things. As you can see, the text repeatedly and explicitly claims to be fully explained. The source points to verses stating things like, "Nothing have we omitted," and "perfected for you your religion." It even asks rhetorically, is it not sufficient for them? And this introduces a fundamental logical problem. If something is, by definition, complete and lacking absolutely nothing, logically it requires zero additions. Yet traditional practice relies heavily on all these additions.
Which leads us to Part 2, the historical investigation. To figure out how this tension developed, the framework argues we have to look at how these secondary sources were actually put together. And when we look at the timeline, a massive gap immediately jumps out. The Quran was compiled in writing very quickly after Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 CE. But Bukhari, the most prominent hadith compiler, he wasn't even born until 810 CE. That is a 178-year gap. You're talking about 6 to 8 generations of purely oral transmission. It's essentially a massive game of telephone spanning almost 2 centuries. And that brings us to a frankly staggering number, 1.2%. According to the source of the roughly 600,000 hadiths that Bukhari reportedly examined, only about 1.2% were accepted as authentic. The source raises a totally fair question here. If 98.8% of the circulating traditions were deemed fabricated or completely unreliable, what does that actually say about the integrity of the overall transmission culture?
From a Quran-centered perspective, relying on oral transmission over that many generations introduces massive reliability problems. I mean, human memory naturally degrades over time, right? On top of that, this era was full of intense political and sectarian splits, giving people massive motivations to just make up sayings to support their specific factions. The scholars living 200 years later tried their best to verify the character of the narrators, but they were relying on totally subjective judgments about people who had died over a century earlier. According to the framework, this inevitably led to profound contradictions, even within the collections that were deemed authentic. So, the crucial point the framework makes is the stark contrast in preservation. You've got the Quran, which features immediate written records, simultaneous mass transmission by thousands of people, and a stated divine promise of protection. In total contrast, the Hadith compilation relies on that 200-year oral gap, individual person-to-person chains, and highly subjective human judgment. The argument is that treating these two vastly different methods of preservation as equally authoritative is just logically flawed.
And that brings us to Part 3, the Primacy framework. This is the proposed theological solution to the historical problem. The source outlines a system that acts as a sort of gatekeeper of faith. It uses a filter stage, referred to as al-Muwaymin. In this stage, any secondary tradition that conflicts with the clear, overarching principles of the Quran, like mercy or freedom of belief, is automatically rejected. This is then followed by a primacy stage, al-Furqan, which officially cements the Quran as the absolute, only fully detailed source of divine law.
Logically, this creates a very strict hierarchy of authority. Rank 1 is the Quran, designated as the law. Rank 2 actually demotes secondary sources like the hadith,
from divine law down to mere historical context. They're useful for understanding 7th century Arabia, for sure, but they aren't spiritually binding. And rank 3 assigns scholarly consensus to the realm of human opinion, meaning it's totally subject to error and bound by the time it was written.
To back up this hierarchy, the source points to specific verses, like Quran 45:6. And what's wild here is that the original Arabic word used for statement in this verse is literally the word hadith. The source argues this acts as a total negation. It's a rhetorical question directly from the text asking, if the Quran is the truth, why would you possibly seek out any secondary religious statements or hadith outside of it?
Moving into part 4, a new way to practice. This is where we get into how this shift actually changes daily life.
When walking believers through this new paradigm, the final stronghold, according to the source, is always this very obvious question. Okay, but how exactly do you practice your religion without the detailed, micromanaged rules of the hadith? How do you know how to pray, or exactly how much charity to give?
The answer requires a fundamental shift in mindset. It means moving away from a rigid, rule-based ritualism, obsessing over exact physical movements and regulations, and shifting toward a flexible, principle-based faith. In this paradigm, the form serves the purpose, not the other way around. The real focus becomes embodying core Quranic values.
To truly figure out what those principles are, this movement uses a linguistic tool called tashrif. Rather than looking at 9th century hadith dictionaries to define what a religious practice is, tashrif actually relies on the Quran's own internal dictionary. It defines its own terms by cross-referencing root words throughout the text itself.
Let's look at how tasrif completely changes some core concepts. Take salat, for example. Traditionally, it's translated strictly as ritual prayer. But if you look at its root word in the Quran, it actually focuses heavily on the principle of connection or commitment to the divine system. So, while the text mentions bowing and prostrating, it doesn't mandate the hyper-specific, strict physical mechanics dictated by the hadith. The actual mandate is sincerity and connection.
You see the exact same thing with zakat. In traditional hadith, it's this incredibly rigid, mathematically complex 2.5% tax calculation with very specific asset thresholds. But using Quranic tasrif, the root word means purification and growth. So the source explains that zakat is redefined as a broader, much more flexible principle. It's the act of providing whatever surplus you have to ensure balanced societal growth, adapting naturally to whatever your specific means might be.
And Hajj undergoes a very similar transformation. The root word literally means to argue, debate, or aim. So in this framework, Hajj is viewed much less as a specific set of mechanical rituals like throwing exactly 7 stones, and more as an intentional great debate. It's viewed as an annual international congress for the global community to gather, witness benefits, and actually solve societal issues.
So ultimately, living day-to-day within this framework centers entirely on intentional freedom. It involves reading the text directly for yourself, in a language you actually understand, rather than relying entirely on scholars to translate the meaning for you. It means focusing heavily on ethics over rituals, and according to the source, it means understanding that if God omitted a specific detail in the text, it wasn't an accident. It's viewed as a deliberate act of mercy, granting humans the freedom to adapt across different cultures and eras. It's really all about trusting your God-given reason over inherited tradition.
To conclude this explainer, we want to leave you with the central, truly provocative question posed by the source material. It's a question that really sums up this entire theological shift we've explored today. If God says His book is complete, why are you looking for completions? It's a profound thought, one that challenges centuries of tradition and invites believers to look directly at the text itself. Thanks so much for joining us as we unpack this framework.